joining this morning. I really do appreciate it. I know it's it's early in the morning to do anything, never mind attend a talk or speak at something. So it's very much appreciated. And if you haven't been before, 5Things is a morning meetup where 3 speakers share 5 key takeaways from one of their favourite non-fiction books. I hope you leave this hour either a bit smarter, hopefully, inspired to pick up one of the books that we talk about today, or just feeling a spot happier about stuff in general. A few bits of housekeeping: the event is being recorded, though you won't appear unless you contribute, and if you could please stay muted whilst the speakers are on, that'd be much appreciated. So, yeah, we'll hopefully have around 20 minutes at the end. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't, to ask the speakers some questions. So if any questions arise while the speakers are on, then just pop them in the chat and hopefully we'll get to them at the end. So last time on 5Things, Andrew gave us sage medical advice that for a long life, one should smoke before you're 55 and take psychedelics after you're 55. Pretty sure that was my key takeaway from that. I'm sure he had much more useful advice. I'm sure Andrew will correct me if that's not right. Philip advised us to stay curious and claimed that there's no age limit to creativity, which, being an old bloke, I totally agree with. And Rita had a hard look at our progressive beliefs through white tears, brown scars, made it clear that the responsibility for change still lies with the marginalised, which obviously isn't great. Every 5Things is recorded, so you can catch up anytime via YouTube, and I'll pop the link in the chat later. So this is the 19th 5Things, and by the end of this event, we'll have explored 57 books, which equates to 285 things. I remember every single one of them, obviously. We've had some truly wonderful speakers, and as always, I'm delighted to add 3 new speakers to this highly esteemed bunch. So we will say hey to Max, Patrycja, and Rebecca. Hey, Max, Patrycja, and Rebecca. Okay, well. My headphones turned themselves off for some reason.
Masters.
Yeah. Yeah. So our first speaker is Max. Max is our self-confessed tutor. He said he's sure he's mentioned to mention it within 5 minutes of meeting you. Is that correct? 5 minutes. And he's come from the bright lights, come to the bright lights of Edinburgh to make his fortune. Fortune is still a work in progress, but in the meantime, he runs events for Codebase Edinburgh and obsesses over the correct pH values of fish tank water, very specific, and adds to his admirably vast collection of autumnal turtlenecks, which don't seem to be sporting one today, Max. But
I genuinely consider it.
I'm a massive workshop geek, so I'm super interested to listen to Max's 5Things on the Workshop Survival Guide by Rob Fitzpatrick and Devin Hunt. Max.
Thank you very much, Maestro. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along. And yes, I'm going to talk today about the Workshop Survival Guide. There is actually quite a substantial subtitle, which I will now say, but please don't feel obligated to remember it. It's the Workshop Survival Guide: How to Design and Teach Educational Workshops That Work Every Time by Rob Fitzpatrick and Devin Hunt. We'll just call it the Workshop Survival Guide, but the subtitle adds a little bit of flavor, I hope. Before I think I go too much into the book itself, I might go a little bit self-indulgently, if that's okay, about why I want to talk about this book today and what this book has sort of meant to me, my story with the book. But first, Andy, if we could jump to the next slide, I would be very much in your debt. So kind of go over the summary and my sort of background to this book. So I've run quite a few workshops before. I used to work in the whiskey industry, so they were pretty easy to sort of be successful with, because people like to drink whiskey, and if they're at a whiskey workshop, you don't have to work hard to win people over. And I've done some educational stuff when I was working for Expedia, but it's been a really, really long time, to be honest, since I've actually facilitated a workshop and planned that whole workshop. And I've found myself in a position where I have a workshop coming up in a couple of weeks' time, and I've spent so much time thinking about it, obsessing about it, to be totally honest, and it's really become quite lionized in my head. And I think it's because we've all been to workshops, and we've all been to workshops that aren't great, and that's all I can kind of think about, all the things that might go wrong, all the things that I can't prepare for, all the things that I can't be ready for. So I thought, I know a lot of people, I mean, that's one thing I'm very lucky in my work, that I know a lot of people who are absolute legendary workshop runners. I mean, Andy's done workshops for us. Lots of people have done great workshops. So decided to reach out to a couple of people. And a colleague recommended me this book, saying it was just a wonderful resource to give you some confidence, particularly in the planning stage, but also just the entire kind of workshop process. So I picked it up, and I am happy to report that I have found it incredibly useful, and it's really increased my confidence. And really, this is what the book is trying to achieve. It's planning and delivering workshops with a more consistent level of quality every single time. So it's that confidence that if you have that plan in place and you have that design in place, you're actually going to be in a really, really good position way before you ever start the actual workshop. So that's a kind of overall backstory. Let's get into the eponymous 5 things. If I could have the next slide, my friend. Thank you. So energy and goodwill are resources. This kind of feels quite self-evident when you reflect on it, but I've never really seen it written out in the way that it's expressed in this book. And I found that really, really interesting and quite useful. So the idea is a great workshop is really just maintaining high levels of energy and engagement. It's a kind of a composite of both enthusiasm and attentiveness, and goodwill, which is really just a way of expressing the trust that the attendees of your workshop have for you as a facilitator. And keeping those in balance and keeping those high, that's what's going to make it successful. So I'll kind of break down each in turn. Goodwill is kind of, I'm going to go the wrong way around because I'm a maverick. You can't stop me, it's my 10 minutes. Goodwill is actually one that you shouldn't worry too much about, and I found that a real learning. Goodwill is generally going to start off pretty high, because more often than not, apart from in very specific scenarios, people are wanting the workshop to be good. Very few people will attend your workshop being like, oh, I hope this is rubbish, There are people out there, but the vast majority of people will be kind of hoping that it will go well for you. So that I find that quite encouraging, and it's a good starting point. Don't go into a room assuming that everyone's going to be like, I hate this person and I want them to fail. Most people want you to succeed, and that's something to keep in mind. You're going to sort of gain more goodwill and grow that goodwill by providing value, and that's, again, feels quite self-evident, but I feel for myself, for instance, I would lean towards trying to provide entertainment, and it's bringing it back and saying, what is the point of this workshop? It's not to entertain, it's to educate. And so that's a really interesting sort of takeaway. In terms of energy, this is a really, really precious resource. Even if you have an incredible set of ideas and learnings to take away from the workshop, if people are knackered, they're going to tune out. If people are tired, they're going to tune out. And so the book recommends that you really, really design your workshop around preserving people's energy, and it gives you some great tips on how to do that. For one thing, it honestly says the most important planning is at the start is make sure you book in your coffee breaks and your lunch breaks first. You should design the whole workshop around what slots you have for coffee breaks and lunch breaks if it's longer than about 90 minutes, because that is really, really important time for people to digest what they're learning and absorb what they're learning, and also just kind of, get a little bit of energy back. And it sort of really warns you against the temptation to eat into your coffee breaks if you're going over. It says QA, that's for sacrificing, but keep your coffee breaks. It calls them sacred, which I love. Coffee breaks are sacred. It's a wonderful statement. It also talks a lot about leaning on different teaching methods in order to preserve energy. Don't just use one method for the entirety of your workshop, and move between different kind of areas of teaching, different styles of teaching, to preserve that energy and keep people engaged and excited and switched on. And one thing that I really, really loved is protect your own energy. The book advises that during a lunch break or a coffee break, you physically go and hide, like in a cupboard. Well, maybe not literally a cupboard, but make sure that you have an area where you can escape and rest, because your energy is important too. And if you're flagging, that is going to bring down the whole facilitation of the workshop. But if you're running a workshop, people want to ask you questions, even on your lunch break. So during your lunch break, go find a corner, but ahead of time, set up a little corner where you can hide. And I just loved having the permission to go and hide, because that is my instinct as well. So it was really, really lovely to see. So that was a bit of a cheeky 5 thing, because I had a lot of things in that. So we'll move on to the next one, which I promise is a little less bloated, and that is outcomes. So outcomes are the most important thing. And again, for me, I think this is something which you kind of know instinctually, but having it written out is so helpful, because my sort of my being, I would want to sort of entertain people first and foremost. And honestly, I'd be like, I want people to like me. But really, the most important thing about designing your workshop is that you are providing great outcomes, that people are going to have high value takeaways that they will leave your workshop with. And by takeaway, I mean new pieces of knowledge. So this 5 things, I think, is an example of actually doing it quite well. You lay out 5 points that you want people to walk away with. And then you build your entire presentation, all the supplementary information is around those 5 main points. And that's really the same core structure that you should apply to your workshop. Have your main learning outcomes, and then draw out from those all the kind of ephemera and flavor, but it has to be about those 4 or 5 or however many you have, those core outcomes. And never lose sight of these. Once you have the breaks in, which do come first, the book recommends bringing in all these outcomes as your next kind of most important thing, and structuring the workshop around how you deliver these outcomes. They are really the kind of the core aspect of the overall project. And if I could have the next slide, please, Maestro. Know who's in the room. And I've just, again, proving my maverick soul, I've got the wrong font in this slide, so I do apologize, Andy. I don't know how I did that, but hopefully adds a bit of spice and excitement for everyone watching today. This is a really interesting one for me, and actually this challenged a lot of my preconceptions, so I really, really wanted to kind of focus on it. It doesn't matter how great, you can have the best workshop ever. You can be the greatest facilitator, you can be charismatic and clever and wise. If you haven't tailored that workshop for the audience who's attending, it's not going to succeed. So if we're thinking about, like outcomes, like we were mentioning before, there's no outcome that's going to be useful for literally everyone. The book itself actually has a phrase it uses for outcomes, which I love how casual it is. It calls them aha moments, where someone's like, oh yeah, and those are really, really great to generate, but you're not going to be able to generate an aha moment if someone is more experienced or already knows those things or has a different kind of perspective on those. So it's now impossible to find one that's relevant to everyone. So for instance, if I was running like a startup founder course, which would, given my work at Codebase is the kind I would be doing, if it's for early founders, I wouldn't be able to use that same workshop for people who were running companies that have been going for years, or who already had, dedicated HR or a partner or CTO, things like that. So it's really, really important to tailor your workshop to the specific people who are going to be attending. And as such, it recommends doing as much research as is reasonably possible ahead of time, depending on who's going to be in the workshop. You should try and establish who they are, why they would want to come to your workshop, what their experience level is going to be, and any kind of concerns that they might have, and kind of tailor it as much as possible. One thing that I found really, really powerful is advertise accurately to your audience. It's so easy to be like, literally everyone can come along. And that is my instinct. It's like, you never want to make people feel excluded. Bums on seats are the ultimate goal of any workshop. But really, if you're building your workshop around learning outcomes, you have to accept that some of these learning outcomes aren't going to be as useful to other people. So just make sure that when you advertise your workshop and when you're building your workshop, to express to people the kind of learning outcomes that you intend, because that way folk will be able to decide themselves if it's going to be useful, and they're going to be much, much better at knowing what they than you are ahead of time. So even though it's kind of counterintuitive to what my gut feeling would be, it's really, really important. And I found that a really valuable learning from this book. Next slide, please, Andy. Don't go flavor crazy. I was really deeply tempted to put a Guy Fieri picture in here, but I didn't have pictures for any of the other slides, and I just thought, I can't just have one with Guy Fieri. Was that a bad shout, folk? Ask me in the questions at the end. I think maybe I should have put Guy Fieri in here. Maybe next time. But this is one that's very, very relevant to me. As I kind of alluded to before, a big approach for when I try like interact and like workshops and things is I want to have a laugh. I want to be fun. You know, I'm like the math teacher who has a piano tie, you know, comes like start swaggering in, oh, I'm jazz hands. But don't make that the focus of your workshop. Yeah, again, I know it's kind of reiterating another of the 5 things, but all things are linked. It's really, really vital that the learning outcomes come first. So when I'm talking about flavor, I'm talking about all the like fun bits. Those have to be the very last thing. And they use a great analogy in the book, which is then they sort of compare it to cooking, which I think cooking is a better analogy because any scenario can be related back to cooking. But it's like spices, your little spices at the end. You can add a bit of spice. It's going to be great. It's going to really elevate the dish. But if you go crazy with spice, it's just going to become an amorphous blob. You're going to, you know, lose the main sort of threads of flavor that the actual food has. So don't go spice wild. Your job isn't to entertain in a workshop. Try and be entertaining if you can, but realize that that's supplemental. Your job is to educate, and that has to be the most important kind of part of what that workshop is about. Unless I suppose you're doing a workshop on entertaining. But again, these are sort of edge cases. And one advice that it gives, for instance, is with your slides. You should be able to make your slide deck in about an hour for about any workshop. Just the absolute core. Forget about all the, you know, bells and whistles and the fun aspects. Sort of dial down on the core, and you'll find you'll have a lot more success. Your energy alone can't carry a workshop. You know, you're a facilitator, not a host. And I know that might feel semantic, but I find sort of focusing on that is actually really helpful. By facilitating a workshop, you are doing something communally. You're not, you know, it's not your show. You're here to bring a group of people together. You are there to facilitate their learning, but come to those conclusions themselves. So don't double down on just trying to, you know, come in singing, dancing. Focus on the content and you will succeed. And Andy, I have no idea if my timing has been on or miles off, but let's go to the final slide for our grand finale, our 5th thing. So a great workshop succeeds in advance. I find this really encouraging, honestly. And I hope, you know, everyone here who might want a workshop one day will find this encouraging too. If your workshop is well designed, it's going to work the vast majority of the time. You can't prepare for all things. You just can't. That's just life. But if you've spent the time to dial in on your outcomes, you go in knowing what your outcomes are, you're going to succeed 9 times out of 10. If you are careful with the goodwill and balance and energy, that's going to help a lot as well. But once you kind of have a good design in place, the facilitation should be easy and actually might even be nice. It might even be fun because you can actually come in and just focus on the day itself. If you do your work in advance for the workshop, if you have your good plan, if you have your good skeleton, you're going to be absolutely laughing all the way to the proverbial bank. And on the note of the proverbial bank, I think I've sort of toddled through my 5 things. Here they are again. I don't know how much time we have, but I'll just read them all out one more time. Energy and goodwill, they're precious resources. Keep them in balance. Don't forget one or the other, and that will help you a lot. It's all about outcomes. When you're building your workshop, think about what you actually want to teach people. What are people going to walk away from the workshop and be like, oh, I went to a great workshop today. Here's what I learned. Know who's in the room. You can't be everything for all people. It's just not possible. So find out who's in the room and make sure that you tailor your workshop as much as possible to your audience. Don't go flavor crazy. It's not Flavor Town. It's Flavor Hamlet. You know, a little bit of spice goes a long way for sure, but don't upend all the cumin in because otherwise you're gonna get a sore tummy. And a great workshop succeeds in advance. Preparation is key. If you take the time to make your plan, and it doesn't have to be years of work, but if you sat down, you've made your skeleton, everything in place, you're going to find that you're going to get great success long before you ever move into the room or the Zoom area that you're doing your workshop. Everyone, thank you so much for listening to my 5 things. I hope you learned something, had a couple aha moments, maybe. If you did, pop it in the chat. And I will pass you back on into the callous, the gentle hands of Andy Irvine.
Thanks so much, Max. That was wonderful. And yeah, I was nodding my head a lot there. I totally agree with all those points. And yeah, very important to keep in mind if you're running workshops, which I do often. So we'll move on straight to Patrycja. Patrycja is the CEO of YWCA Scotland, a feminist organisation with over 160 years history and part of a worldwide movement of women leading change. I was lucky enough to work alongside YWCA and Patrycja recently. I can tell you firsthand what a wonderful organisation they are and how much blood, sweat and tears and other things Patrycja and the team put into such an essential cause. I wrote down also, I recently found that Patrycja's background is in archaeology. I underplayed background. She is a doctor, has a doctorate in archaeology. So that's more than a background. So I assume that prompted her to share our next book, Kindred, Neanderthal Love and Death and Art, by Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Patrycja.
Thank you, Andy. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So yeah, you're getting, if you know me through my work, you're getting a very different side of me today. So this is very much my archaeology geek hat on. So bear with me. And I'm also like thinking about like what Max was saying and like trying to apply it very quickly to my talk. So if we can go to the next slide, yeah, so this is a description of this book that I really like. A new understanding of Neanderthals, shoving aside clichés of rag-clad brutes in an icy wasteland. So these are some of the themes that we'll be exploring today. And I chose this book, first of all, because I'm really interested in archaeology, but secondly, because when I was still teaching archaeology at university, one of the first year essays that tended to be most popular with our undergrad students was kind of looking at Neanderthal anatomy, biology, culture, and kind of evidence for like social connections and like trying to assess their humanness. So like some very big questions that we gave to our first year students and some very interesting answers always. But think about like anything that we are assessing archaeologically, we're doing it on a basis that if we see something, like our ancestors maybe thought something similar about it. So if you look at something and you feel like, oh, that has like an artistic value or a symbolic value, like we apply it to archaeology, but then how about the archaeology of a different species with a different brain? Can we find those like human connections that we can recognize? And if we cannot, does that mean there weren't there? Or is just our definition of what it means to be human not flexible enough? So I will go through a couple of things, couple of kind of interesting points from the book. So if we can go to this slide, thank you. So yeah, first of all, what remains? Like, what do we know about Neanderthals? Well, we didn't know anything about them until the 19th century. So that's when they were discovered. So even though they walked the earth for about 500,000 years, we didn't know anything about them until the 19th century. What we know about them is based on 200 to 300 individuals. So I think there's around 25 people here today, 30 people. So if all of you brought 9 friends with you, so imagine like 9 friends, 9 family members, and then imagine that would be the basis of our understanding of our own species, because that's how much we currently have for Neanderthals. However, because their population sizes were much smaller, we're probably like that represents probably 0.01% of their total population. If we narrow it down, we're looking at probably 30 to 40 more complete skeletons. So within that assemblage of 300, many of them are like a skull fragment or a toe or a rib. So we are not talking about whole individuals there. So looking at the skeleton, I have a very useful comparison from the book. So on the right, you can see modern humans. On the left, that's Neanderthal. So you can probably see some marked differences straight away. So they were shorter, stockier, longer limbs, much wider chests. And then if you want to just like touch your chin and like go in here, like you feel like a bony part. They didn't have that. So that bit would be completely soft. Then if you go alongside your brow ridge, like it's not joined up. and it's not extremely pronounced, and all Neanderthals, it would be very pronounced and joined up. Then if you go across your forehead, you should feel like a little bit of curve. It will be different for different people. For Neanderthals, it will be completely flat. Then if you have your wisdom teeth, or if you can feel where they are about to erupt, go over that area with your tongue. With Neanderthals, they would have like a massive gap and then their wisdom tooth, and they probably use that bit as a tool. So we see like a lot of wear on teeth on either side. So they probably used it to like work leather and things like that. But what else? Well, they also had like much bigger eye sockets. So their eyes were much bigger than ours, more photo absorbent, and they had greater light sensitivity. So they were apex predators. They probably could see in the dark much better than we can. Their ears were different to us anatomically, but all the kind of computational models that we have, and of course that's all based on bones. Like, you know, we don't have like any soft flesh preserved Neanderthals yet, maybe one day. But yeah, all the models show that their ears were likely to have transferred and amplified sounds similar to our own hearing. So they probably would have heard similar range of sounds. Their noses were much bigger, which initially was thought to be related to like much better kind of sensitivity to smells and connected to their hunting abilities. And now that we know more about brains, it turns out that it definitely wasn't true, because the part of the brain called olfactory bulb was much smaller in Neanderthals. So that's the part that like processes smells. So that function was probably related to warming and moistening air. So their nasal structure actually resembles that of a reindeer. So they lived in cold climates, so they could take like really deep breaths, then kind of warm up that air before it hits like our very delicate lungs. There's some evidence for how things would taste to them. So there is one particular genetic marker that we share with them, which is kind of responsible for us not liking bitter and sour tastes very much. But in Neanderthals, there was another genetic marker that kind of dialed it down a little bit. So they probably could enjoy things that were sour and bitter more than we can. Okay, so next slide, Andy, if I may. Oh no, sorry. Oh yeah, this one. Perfect, thank you. So another massive question is like, did they have language? Because our entire culture, our entire social interactions are based on our ability to communicate. So they had much bigger brains than we do, which is great. But they also had, as I already told you, flatter foreheads. So they had less room for frontal cortex, which is connected to thought processes like memory and language. They had smaller cerebelli. So that's another area of brain that is connected to communication. So basically all language related zones in the brain were smaller in Neanderthals than they are in us. Having said that, the Homo sapiens that lived at the same time that Neanderthals did had bigger brains than we do. And we do not, well, we assume that there was no cognitive impairment to our brains actually shrinking. Although if you look at climate change and how we are treating the environment, like maybe there is some sort of a connection. But yeah, that fact doesn't mean necessarily that they wouldn't be able to communicate. Their throats were shaped to make similar sounds to us, so they would have ability to speak. They had similar rate of handedness, meaning that they were mainly right-handed, which in us is like also connected to like speech patterns in the brain. And there's so much evidence of them producing complex objects, like having entire cultures of like lithics, potential musical instruments, potential arts, very skilled kind of collaborative hunting. So probably some form of communication existed, but whether it was something that would be recognizable to us, very hard to say. But we know way more than we did about their ability to speak in the last kind of 20, 30 years. And then next slide, please. I feel like a really pretentious professor, like having like a teaching assistant. I mean, like, next slide, please. I've witnessed it many times in my time in academia. Violence, like we assumed for many, many years that they were quite violent. And that's based on high rate of trauma in their bones that we have, and mainly head trauma. But now having more understanding how trauma is formed, the trauma that would be related to fighting is most likely to be facial, and then above the level of ears. So if you think about someone who's been in a fight, broken nose, bruises under their eyes, probably not stuff like on their chin, kind of lower, and probably not on top of their head. Like it's really hard to like punch someone on top of their head unless they are kneeling. So there are actually only 2 really strong cases that can be linked to violence. One of them is a male individual from Shanidar, and he had chest stabbing wound so deep that it cut across the ribs. And actually the tip of the kind of stone tool that was used to inflict that wound on him was still embedded in his ribs, but they healed around that, which shows that kind of some medical care and looking after that individual also happened. And then there is a female individual from southwest of France who had a 7 centimeters deep wound to the top of her head, consisted with a sharp-edged object. So it looks like she was kneeling down and someone like hit her really hard on the top of her head with something really sharp. But again, there is evidence of that wound healing as well. It's hard to say if she actually survived, but she at least survived for a couple of weeks for us to see that. So actually compared to like evidence of our own species from the same time, not higher levels of violence at all. High mortality rates, lots of accidents probably, but also evidence of healing and looking after disabled members of community. So there is another individual from Shanidar who was the unluckiest person that I can imagine. Like he sustained so many wounds. He was probably partially blind as a result, probably impaired hearing. At one point, one of his arms had to be amputated. Presumably by someone else, because it's probably hard to do it yourself. But then it healed, and actually he lived for many, many years after that, because we see that he adapted to just using one of his arms. So there's definitely that sort of community spirit, looking after people, some kind of medical support and help. And next slide, please. So food. We used to think that Neanderthals were those just apex predators, eating mammoth and bears and big game, which is true. They were very skilled at hunting big game. But now that we have more archaeological evidence and we are more interested in looking at all the teeny tiny bone fragments and all the evidence that we can get out of that, we now have evidence that they ate everything. Small game, rodents, birds, seafood, specialized hunting, just everything. And going back to like think about their bigger bodies, shorter legs, they had larger heart, larger brain, and they lived in cold climates. They needed more calories. So the estimates are that in cold climates, they would need up to 7,000 calories a day per individual, which is an equivalent to blowout Christmas binge. So if you think about like a couple of drinks and then your breakfast and lunch and then eating leftovers and maybe trifle and cake and all that, cheese board, like that's roughly a daily equivalent of what Neanderthals would have needed. 10 Neanderthals a week would need 300,000 calories, or 3 reindeer a week, which is 2 times more than average wolf pack. But of course, like being humans, they also needed more than just kind of carnivorous diets. We like to think about them as eating just meat, like all the kind of paleo diets. And I heard that the paleo diet is now called Neanderthal thin, which is the worst pun ever, but they definitely didn't just consume meat. And we now have evidence from calculus or tartar, so what your dentist cleans at like every checkup appointment. Neanderthals didn't have the benefit of that, so it would build up on their teeth. And there's evidence within that of consumption of dates, peas, lentils, roots, tubers, seeds, like all sorts of vegetables. So their diet was probably very varied. So if you want to go on paleo diet, like please do not believe that this is actually just meat-based. And then the final slide, I'll just go through that really quickly. Thank you. What do we know about Neanderthals based on our own DNA? Well, we know that about 1.8 to 2.6 our modern human DNA comes from Neanderthals. So we now have a very clear evidence of interbreeding. So there are periods of time that our species had babies together. We do not see the same evidence in Neanderthal species. So there is evidence for Neanderthal genes coming into our species, but not vice versa, which could be based on a small sample size. We don't know. And it's in all humans except for these from sub-Saharan heritage. So these are the only humans that we do not see that sort of influence of Neanderthal DNA. It is lowest for Western Europeans at around 2% or under, and it's slightly higher for indigenous Americans, Asians, and Aboriginal Australians. And what does that mean? Like, what did we inherit from them? So I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that Neanderthals passed on to our species. There is a gene protecting us from bacteria that can cause stomach ulcers. So if you had a stomach ulcer, you are not likely to have that gene, but some people do. Genes that make our hair, nails, and skin are passed on from Neanderthals. And it's possibly because they are more useful as our species expanded beyond tropical environments. So our lighter skins and being able to metabolize vitamin D better as a result of that was probably advantageous. Body clock genes, so the fact that like we respond to those like daily rhythms of like when it's sunny, when it's dark, and it's probably for Neanderthals to better cope with long winters. So naturally, like if you feel really sluggish when it's dark in the morning, that's probably from Neanderthals. A gene that affects how fats move into cells, also from Neanderthals, which in our species sadly means higher risk of type 2 diabetes, but it would have been advantageous in environments when you would go through periods of starvation, like having that better energy management. And also genes promoting fatness and connected to addictions come from Neanderthals. And it's probably advantageous kind of consuming fat-rich food and like seeking out those foods, again, in those environments where that wouldn't be the norm, with a massive caveat that this is all based on 40 samples. So we know all of that based on 40 samples. So as we test more, we'll probably know more about that. But yeah, we all carry a bit of Neanderthal in all of us. And the final slide, just a summary of all these things. So what remains? Not a lot, but what we know through what remains is actually quite a lot. I think I will leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Patrycja. That was fascinating. I was captivated there. I really need you to try and do a show on BBC or something. I can imagine the visuals or the mock-ups of Neanderthal life already. I'd be 100% watch that. That was so good. Yeah. Thank you.
And I would just say that I would really recommend that book because it has those like narratives in it. So there's a lot of science, but there's a lot of like just imagining how Neanderthals would live in a very kind of creative narrative way. So if you're not into like just like scientific data being thrown at you, like this book is really great.
That was so good. Thanks so much, Patrycja. We'll move on to our final talk of the day, Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. So Rebecca Lowe is a freelance writer, facilitator, and events coordinator based here in Edinburgh, or where I am in Edinburgh. Having previously worked in creative learning and education, she's currently writing, thinking, and reading lots about working culture, the changing nature of career, and how the places and spaces where we work, rest and play are evolving. Rebecca, as some of you may know, is also a member of the Creative Mornings Edinburgh team, who host inspiring monthly speaker events around the city. I love Creative Mornings. We all struggle with productivity guilt, or at least I do. So I'm delighted to say that Rebecca is about to give us the antidote. Is that right? By sharing her by sharing her 5 things from I Don't Do the Thing Today by Madeleine Dore.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I don't know if I've got a solution, but I've certainly got some ideas from this book about it. So I Didn't Do the Thing Today is a book about letting go of productivity guilt. It's about dismantling the idea that our self-worth is defined by the work that we do, and it's about finding joy in the kind of stumbles of our everyday. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Andy. It is a culmination of a decade of work nearly a decade of work by the writer Madeleine Dore. So kind of back in 2013-14, Madeleine found herself in a bit of a creative and professional rut, but she was convinced that if only she could find, the right productivity hack, the perfect morning routine, some sort of secret sauce, that would be the key to her own success and ultimately her own happiness. She saw that other people seemed to be getting it right, so what was it that she was missing? So she began speaking to people that she knew and that she admired about their own creative processes. And eventually these conversations became the Extraordinary Routines Project, which started as a blog and eventually became an accompanying podcast as well. And it kind of paints a fascinating picture about personal passion, about procrastination, and kind of ultimately starts to demystify the whole creative process and what we think about productivity around that. And big spoiler alert, she found that there isn't actually one secret way to hack your own productivity or optimize every area of your life and your work. But what she found instead was that when it comes to happiness, self-worth, and settling on your own kind of version of success, none of that stuff actually matters. So I kind of came across this book quite recently. I quit my full-time job at the start of last year to go fully freelance. And with that, kind of found myself questioning my own worth, my capabilities, all those kind of, oh my God, what have I just done thoughts. Now that I wasn't in an organization and surrounded by a sense of structure and expectation. So call it divine intervention, call it fate, or more likely my Instagram algorithm. Madeleine's work and this book kind of started popping up everywhere. So I thought, do you know what? I need something to read, so let's go for it. And it turned out to be a real ideal, reassuring hand on my shoulder that I needed at the time. So although a lot of the stuff she kind of collates for this book aren't necessarily new or even that groundbreaking, I found that a lot of it really kind of spoke to me. So I'm going to share 5 things from it with you today. So the first one is that we should think of our days as fecund and not finished. So there's a thread that runs through this book that the idea of focusing on productivity as an end goal in itself actually narrows our lives. And that actually at first might feel a little bit counterintuitive. Productivity, as we are told, is about filling our time, it's about giving ourselves purpose, it's about things to do, having things to show for the time that we spend on this earth. But actually, Madeleine says that filling our days with things to be ticked off, actually, all that does is it leaves us with no space for spontaneity, for growth, mistakes, learning, all the kind of good stuff about life. So she says that we need to get a new perspective. So something that's fecund is capable of producing new growth. And it's also just a lovely earthy word. Madeleine suggests that it could be better to think of our days as fecund and continuous and cyclical, and not kind of just like a series of boxes to be filled, finished, onto the next one, and a kind of never-ending line. Obviously, using nature in this way to kind of parallel our existence and experience as humans isn't new, but I really like this way of thinking about it. It places the same amount of importance on moments of rest and quiet and thinking and reflection as it does on the times when we need connection, motivation and action. And the way she talks about it is that if we plant seeds in a window box, we don't give up on them and chuck out the soil just because we don't have a tub full of blooms after one day. So perhaps we should treat ourselves with the same patience and that willingness to nurture the soil that we're in and our things around us, even and especially when we're not necessarily outwardly flourishing. Okay, and I can have the next slide, please, Andy. Thank you. So the second thing that I took from this book was to treat every day as an experiment. And obviously, like I say, this isn't a new idea, but it's still a really interesting one for me. So if the pursuit of productivity narrows, our lives. It's creativity is the thing that expands our lives. And a big part of this book is about creativity as an antidote to any feelings of guilt, shame, and failure that we associate with constantly being productive or feeling like we have to be productive. And that's not just creativity in its traditional form, though I'm a huge advocate of including even just the smallest amount of unmonetized making, writing, reading, painting, music, whatever it is in your daily life, especially if your kind of main job is traditionally creative, because these are the things that really nourish and inspire us. But obviously not just creativity in that sense, but also about taking on a more creative perspective and thinking about our days differently. So productivity, if that's a fixed outcome, you either do the thing or you don't do the thing. And usually when we don't do the thing, it's a marker of failure. We didn't do, so we did nothing, and nothing isn't worth anything. That's what we're told. Whereas creativity is all about experimentation, it's about space, it's about trial and error, it's about learning. And of course, the differing degrees of privilege that we all experience dictate the things that we have to do and the certain responsibilities that we have to meet each day, whether that's working in a 9-to-5, caring for children or for elderly parents, all these different things. And sometimes it feels that life happens. Life is the thing that happens in those kind of pockets of time around those responsibilities. And we feel that those pockets of time, there's a real pressure to optimize them. We have to make them productive as well. That has to be when we, check our emails before work. That's when we have to put on a wash. That's when we have to, call the car mechanic. But this book kind of encourages to actually sometimes, why not use that time to experiment instead? And by experiment, that could be, doing something kind of traditionally creative, might be, kind of doing a bit of writing, a bit of journaling, whatever it is. It might be just for going a walk around the block. Or it might be, and I don't know why this one almost feels the most radical, it might just be about, staying in bed an extra 20 minutes in the morning. If you've got that time that you usually spend kind of opening up your laptop before you even start work, do you need to be there? So doing something different with that time, it might feel worse, it might not make you feel any different at all, and actually all that is fine as well. But in the book, Madeleine likes to bet that it'll make you feel better when you choose experimentation first and not productivity, and not worry about the outcome. Because the creative approach to our days like this is really key to developing our intuition and understanding around what works for us, not what we're told is meant to work for us. Okay, and that takes us on to our point 3. Thank you, Andy. So point 3 is about having less routine and more rhythm. We obviously live in a world that's obsessed by routines. We are told that having a routine is a solution to all our ills. I did a bit of a very quick research on TikTok before coming on to do this morning. And the hashtag morning routine has been viewed 6.6 billion times on TikTok, which blows my mind. And there are millions and millions of video hours and words online dedicated to evangelizing the benefits of a routine. So like, you want to be a millionaire, you better have a routine. You want to have more time in your day, well, you better have a routine. You want to feel happier, you better have a routine. And it's not to discount that for some people, routine is useful and can even be genuinely life-changing and life-saving. But also I feel suspicious, and so does Madeleine in the book, that these kind of so-called perfect routines, they all look very similar. They're all kind of very glossy. They all involve getting up at a ridiculous hour in the morning, kind of like that picture on the slide, waking up with the sunrise. They usually involve some sort of really intense form of exercise in the morning, eating a very restrictive kind of diet, and just doing loads and loads and loads of stuff before our days even start. And like, for a lot of people, that is just not practical. And we know already that there's no one size fits all hack to kind of optimizing our life and success. And these copy and paste routines are actually kind of just setting us up to fail, because life is messy and there are things that happen every single day that are completely out of our control. Things don't go to plan, and sometimes that can be a small thing, sometimes it can be something much bigger or more inconvenient. But just because things change and things get disrupted, that doesn't mean that we've failed. Madeleine writes in the book that these disruptions are actually about bringing new possibilities. And while some people might find reassurance in kind of tightly regulated timings and having kind of every hour of the day allocated to something, I think that we will hopefully find a little bit more joy in being a little bit more looser and kind of listening to ourselves and actually, what do we want? So instead of judging ourselves when days take a bit of an unexpected turn, we should lean into the change of rhythm rather than kind of fight it. And different periods of our lives follow different rhythms. You know, things that worked for you 5 years ago, or even things that worked for you 5 days ago, aren't necessarily going to work today, and that's fine. This book really kind of encourages you not to force it and feel bad when things kind of don't go as planned, especially when you're taking that kind of plan from someone else's template. Our worth is not determined by the time that we get up in the morning or how many hours we sit at a laptop. So let's not kind of pigeonhole ourselves into someone else's routine, and listen to our own rhythms a bit more. Okay, and thing number 4 is one that really struck home for me, is that curiosity is the cure for comparison. And comparison was a big driver behind Madeleine starting her Extraordinary Routines project, because she was looking at all these other people who were super successful, and she was like, "Why? What am I doing wrong? What am I doing different?" And of course, social media offers a level of access and insight into other people's lives that I think we're just simply not meant to have. We're not meant to have that much information and kind of visual stimulus about other people's lives. So it's no wonder that we're constantly comparing our own lives, our own success, our own output to those of others, you know, people we don't even know. And even though we know it's a snapshot, quite often of a complete stranger's life that we don't have any knowledge or context for, these comparisons can make us feel frustrated, like a failure, unfulfilled, lazy. I know that I've certainly used those words to myself plenty of times. And in the book, Madeleine writes that the comparison pulls us away from ourselves and our own joy. So to quote a bit from the book, she says, "We can easily miss what we really want when we keep getting lost in other people's lives. We berate ourselves for not doing the thing today, forgetting that it's actually someone else's thing that we want to do." So again, taking us back to creative thinking, she encourages us to kind of flip comparison, look at it from a different place. So instead of being scared or guilty about feelings of comparison and subsequent feelings of envy, which we are told are bad, what if we approach comparison with curiosity? What if comparison and feelings of envy are actually a signal to us about what it is we really want? So an example might be, you feel like you're comparing yourself to your professionally really successful friend who somehow also manages to get up and run 10K every morning. This book kind of encourages us to get curious about that envy and interrogate, what is it actually that we're craving when we think about that friend? Is it that we want more time outside? Is it that we want more time to ourselves, time to move our body, something like that? It's not that necessarily we actually want to lift their kind of daily routine and instantly put it on ours. And the same thing is strangers on the internet. You're seeing someone who seemingly has loads of friends, constantly attending parties and events, having a great time. If we interrogate that, is it actually that we want more connection? We want to not feel isolated. We want to feel seen, part of a community. Very rarely is it that we want exactly the thing that we're seeing and comparing. And Madeleine Dore suggests that we get curious about it and then think about how you can incorporate these more specific and personal things into our own daily rhythms. After all, we know there's no copy and paste, one size fits all solution to our happiness. Okay, and moving on to the final thing is be delightfully disciplined. So this one I found a little bit difficult, I'm not gonna lie, but it is really interesting. Sometimes in life, you have to do the thing. You have to do the thing. You know, we all have responsibilities and sometimes things have to get done. And often the best way to get these important things done, we're told, is to be a disciplined person, you know, the most optimized, productive person in the room. But in the book, Madeleine writes about how the word discipline carries so many negative connotations. It's actually about punishment, rigidity. It might even be about conformity for you. It's about productivity. All that contained in this one word that we are told is such an important thing to be. So we develop a bit of a fear around this idea of discipline and doing the thing, and believing that we'll be punished, usually by ourselves, you know, if we don't meet those rigid expectations. So then it's safer not to do anything at all, which we also berate ourselves about. So we're kind of frozen in this cycle of fear and inaction, and even when it comes to things that we have to do or even want to do. But like I say, sometimes we do have to do the things. So what if discipline wasn't something you either are or you're not? What if discipline was a skill that could be learned? And as we've discussed already, learning all that kind of good stuff, it's all about growth, it's about flow, flexibility, about making mistakes, curiosity, creativity, all that good stuff. That's everything that we're taught that discipline isn't about, but actually, what if it could be? And taking this even further, what if we change the things that we want to cultivate a discipline around? So instead of discipline and being disciplined only being about work and output and productivity and making money, Madeleine Dore asks us to kind of consider some other suggestions about what we can be disciplined about. So what if we were disciplined about being kind? What if we were disciplined about the things that nourish us? What if we were disciplined about how we talk to ourselves? Reserving judgment, saying, I don't know, doing things differently. How much happier would we be if these were the things that we focused our attention and our energy on, rather than just terrifying ourselves into constantly producing and improving and optimizing just for the sake of it? So that's the final thing. And just to kind of recap the 5 things from this book, it's about treating our days like they are fecund and not finished and cyclical, and there's room for it all. Treating every day like an experiment, having a creative outlook on things, scrapping the routine, more listening to the rhythms and things that actually suit our lives, being curious rather than simply comparing yourselves to other people, and then that last one, delightfully disciplined. I'm thinking about actually what are the things that we want to cultivate and get good at in our life. And just before I finish, I want to kind of leave you with a really nice quote that Madeleine often signs off her podcast episodes with. So, there's more to our days than what we did or didn't do. So we may as well find a way to enjoy it. And that's me. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Rebecca. Thank you so much, and such a nice quote to leave us on for the rest of the day as well. So I think that it's just past 9, and unfortunately we won't have any time for questions, but a final round of applause for our 3 speakers. I really enjoyed today, and yeah, where else can you get talks about workshops, Neanderthals, and productivity other than 5 things? And I'll leave you to the question. I wonder if Neanderthals had productivity guilt and whether they workshopped the solutions. A question for another day. Well, thanks again, folks, and yeah, we'll hopefully do this again next month. But yeah, have a great day. Don't be too guilty. Don't feel too guilty about not getting too much done. Is that the key? Anyway, thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.